All right, folks. We're gonna jump in here pretty quick today. And first question I have for you is, what do you remember about Federalist number 10 and/or Brutus number 1? You have access to those, but you also watch some videos that kind of walk you through some key parts of those documents. Okay, so help me out here. What do you remember about Federalist number 10, which all of you in this room should remember something from at least last year, maybe? Sure. You know that this is all about the Constitution. It's pro-Constitution. This is right after they wrote the Constitution, they released it to the states, where they kept a big secret when they were writing it. And now it's a matter of whether the states will ratify it. Cool. All right, what else? You remember about either one? Written by Madison. Cool. Remember that the Federalist Papers were written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay. James Madison. J. Mads. Let's call him J. Mads. What else? What else do you remember about these? Yeah, and he wrote like pretty much the majority of the Federalist Papers. Yeah. That was in the musical, by the way, if anybody watched it on Disney Plus. That was a fact. We know that we know Hamilton the musical is not the authoritative source on Hamilton, but there are some really cool things in there. I know, really, did they sing all the time back? Between that and Pocahontas, I feel like people sang in olden times more. No, but you are correct. He wrote a lot of them. He wrote like, something every 3 days. Very gifted writer. And if anything, the way I understand his like ideas in his brain were faster than he could get them on paper. He just always going. Okay, what else? So therefore, Brutus number 1. So if you didn't watch those videos or read any of it, this is one of kind of our foundational documents, all right? Brutus number 1 is kind of considered what's called some of the Anti-Federalist Papers, and is basically, at least concerned, if not against, the Constitution. And this argument gets into between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists over that concern against a unitary government. That's what the Anti-Federalists were worried about, and whether or not we should keep a confederation government like we had under the Articles of Confederation. Because the Anti-Federalists believed that we need to make sure we don't give too much power to the government. They had a lot of problems. They looked at that Constitution, they picked it apart. For example, they're like, you have an executive, okay? That executive could end up being the most powerful person in the world, which kind of sort of came true. But they have a lot of concerns about that. And a lot of what they argue is that Constitution gives too much power to the government. We don't want to be like Britain again. Federalist number 10 is trying to kind of quell those fears, as is all the Federalist Papers, right? You want to be persuasive and convince people. So in Federalist number 10, Madison tackles which topic? And since you all had an awesome A-Push class last year, you did this a little bit last year too. Does he talk about checks and balances in Federalist number 10? Sort of, kind of, but not specifically, though we're going to see that in 51 here today. What's that? He talks about a Bill of Rights will address some of their fears, but they had a number of fears, and one of their fears was factions. You remember factions? Okay, so he addresses factions in this particular document. He talks about the fact that there are different factions What happens if I think we need a lot more gun control and the gun rights lobby runs our government? That's like a fear that anti-federalists might have had. What happens if one group, one religious group runs things? Because religious groups are factions. Factions aren't necessarily a bad thing. What happens with that? Will my rights being denied? And Madison argued a few things. One thing he argued is that factions keep each other in check. If you have a minority faction, which in some governments in Europe, the monarchy was part of a minority faction, okay? We have set up a system with voting to keep them in check. If you have a majority faction, what's going to keep them in check is other factions. So you know how in Washington, sometimes you're like, they're not getting anything done. Why are they always arguing? That's not necessarily always a bad thing. Sometimes it is. Like, hey guys, we need relief money, and both parties are kind of dragging their feet with this. There's some things we need sooner than later. But there's other times where that's not necessarily a bad thing. So here's what I'm going to tell you. Those foundational documents, you need to at least understand kind of the gist of what they're getting at. And we're going to look at that with Federalist number 51 today. Because in your notes, so remember that I gave you in Schoology, I gave you a note and outline and study guide here, which actually I already have a copy here, okay? And we're going to be looking at the principles of American government today, like kind of what our government's founded on. And there's a couple statements that are here, and you can really accept them as fact. The power, it says here, the powers allocated to Congress, the president, and the courts demonstrate the separation of powers and checks and balances features of the Constitution. So we're going to kind of sort of cover the three branches, though you know some things about it, and some of the videos are going to help you there. But the second part of this, and by the way, this is under the big idea of competing policy interests. Okay, policy making interests. Okay, we have different people with different interests. I'll put it to you this way. Think about our school district, and we have only so much money, right? Okay, we might have less money because there's an interest out there that would say, let's raise less money for the schools because I have to pay for that, and those are taxes, and they're getting high, and so on. But we have so much money. What if we dedicated all of our athletic budget to lacrosse? Girls lacrosse. That would be a problem. Some of the swimmers and soccer players and our cheer squad and our boys lacrosse would say, that's not right, okay? But we do have competing policy making interests. If we took that whole budget and gave it to one team, man, they would have everything they need. They'd have a really sweet bus, no more going to games on a yellow cheese wagon, we'd get them a really nice bus, we get them really nice uniforms and all that. And that'd be awesome to have those things for your team. But we have to kind of consider how we do that. Competing does not necessarily always mean we have to be in each other's face about it, okay? Or what if we took the total school budget, we dedicated some to academics, but then we dedicated, all of it to the music and arts programs. Nothing left for athletics, nothing left for some of the other stuff. This is a competing interest there, right? Okay. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at Federalist number 51. Now, the whole document is in your foundational documents folder and resources. We're going to look at some chunks of it. All right. And it says here that this document explains how constitutional provisions of separation of powers and checks and balances control abuses by majorities. But it's not enough to just know that fact. I want us to see how that is done. Okay. You're going to have to do some good analytical reading. A lot of what you're reading this year is not like what you read last year, which was mostly historical documents, and we looked at bias and things like that. You're reading a lot more of persuasive documents and governmental documents, actual laws and things. This is a persuasive document, okay? So, couple things here, all right? First off, at the top, okay, we have a little bit of background here. It says the structure of government must furnish proper checks and balances between different departments. Okay, that's kind of the headline they put in the newspaper. Remember that Madison, Jay, and Hamilton published these in the New York newspapers, particularly in the Independent Journal. Remember that whoever Brutus was and some of the other anti-federalists put their letters in the newspapers. Why? That's the closest thing to social media of that day. Okay, that's where people got their news, they read things, and they didn't just read them in New York City. These papers were published and printed and distributed amongst the colonies. Okay, now states. Sorry, the states. We also know they signed it Publius. Does anyone remember from last year what that name meant? It means like public. It specifically means like people lover. Okay, it goes back to a Roman leader. It's a pseudonym, but it's kind of an open secret that it's one of those guys. This particular one was written by Madison himself, again, to the people of the state of New York. So published to the state of New York, but it resonates with some of the other states, with all the other states. Now, I put in here a guided reading, meaning I have some questions here. It's worth looking at them ahead. What are the necessary partitions, and why is it necessary to partition government? So first off, what does that word partition mean? To separate, right? To divide, okay? You might have learned in global or world history about how India was, they used the word partitioned into India and Pakistan after World War II. Remember that? Kind of, sort of, maybe, yeah. All right, to separate, okay? We, in a sense, sort of, so sometimes you put like a wall called a partition down. We have kind of partitioned this class. You know, there's like a whole bunch of your other classmates that are not here today. They'll be here with me Thursday. Okay? If anybody's like, oh, I got to work, I need my days off. I'm like, really? Okay, come on. Sean said, by the way, I'm not giving you enough work. So, oh, is that not what I said? No. You're saying, oh, is that what you're saying? You're saying, you know, it's just too much work. You know, it's more fun than I know what to do with. I got you. Okay, I misunderstood. My bad. Okay. Nobody wants to be that guy. It's kind of like when you go to a meeting, you know, and there's no like time limit on the meeting, and they're like, anybody have any questions? I'm like, I'm not asking questions. I'm not going to be that guy that keeps this longer. You should do that in college, though. You should ask. Okay, here we go. Madison. He says, to what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among several departments as laid down in the Constitution? Remember, they've read the Constitution. Okay, they just haven't ratified it yet. So what does he mean by, what are those necessary partitions? Think about what are the main jobs of government. And you guys know this, right? First off, we know where this is going. How many partitions are we going to talk about? 3. We're going to divide the government into 3 groups, right? By the way, the Constitution has also divided up governmental power another way between the federal government and the states, remember? They have powers reserved for the states, okay? Like we're slicing in a few different ways here. Okay? So we're really talking about our 3 branches, right? But I want us to think about that. Let's keep reading. He says, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, you know, trying to do things outside the government to check government, exterior, he says the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government. So we've already separated between states and federal a bit, but within the government, he says of the government as that its several constituent parts may by their mutual relations be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. So why does he think it's necessary to partition the government? So nothing's too powerful. And he says to keep them in their proper places. if we have to have rules and laws, we need someone to make the rules. But if we have rules, they have to be enforced, right? If we just put a sign on the highway that says speed limit, whatever, but nobody ever pulls over anybody, you guys are all driving now, right? You ever driven where you see the lights up ahead? You see the police lights? What do? Oh gosh, yeah, okay. It's not like deliberate, like, oh, I think I should slow down at this point. You just naturally like, you don't want to slow. Hopefully you're young drivers, but you're learning, like, you want to ease into that slow down because you don't want to look, you don't look like you were going fast, like you just kind of, okay. You hit the brakes too hard, they're like, what was that jerk? Oh, maybe they were speeding too, okay? But that kind of is a deterrent, isn't it? All right, and I'm not saying you're deliberately speeding all the time. I'm not saying you have the need for speed. You do, I know. But, okay, you just might be, oh, I lost track, holy cow. I thought I was only going like 62 and I'm going like, 84. Okay, it happens, One of those car shows, I think it wasn't World Tour, what was the other one? Top Gear, remember watched Top Gear? They once drove a Bugatti, which can go like 400 miles an hour. It was really a cool car. And they took it out on the Autobahn and went like 400 miles an hour. And the guy who drove it says, yeah, and then I slowed down and I felt like I was going slow enough that I could step out. And I looked and I realized I was still going 85 because I had just been going 400. And when you go 85 after that, it feels like really slow. Yeah. So we have to enforce the laws and we have to make sure they're carried out fairly. Those are kind of the important jobs of government. If we give it all to King Dom here, okay, he's going to be like, I made the rules and this is what I meant by them, okay, and I might enforce them for other people. It might be take it easy on some other people at the same time, okay, all right, and Dom, you're not being fair. Yes, I am, because I'm the one in charge. There's too much room for abuse. All right, next section, he says, what does Madison mean when he says each department should have a will of their own? And what are 3 departments? We know the answer to this already, but let's see if he puts it in there anyway. Let's just see for kicks. Okay. He says, in order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, and we kind of establish those, make laws, enforce laws, interpret laws of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own. Okay? So first off, what does he mean when he says they should have a will of their own? What does that mean, to have a will of your own? Maybe what's another word for that, of having a will of your own? You each have a different job. And is he saying that job should be dependent on what the other's doing? If you have a will of your own, for example, anyone ever babysit a toddler? They have a will of their own, right? Okay? They kind of think what they think and do what they do, okay? It is independent from what you might think, okay? He's saying each branch, it's not enough to have 3 branches. They have to be separate from each other, okay? Congress can do its thing and the president can yell at them or whatever, or the president can do his thing and Congress can yell at him all they want, but they have to have that will of their own. You might have heard people recently say, President Trump can't appoint a Supreme Court justice right now. He can, okay? He can, all right? Have that will of your own, all right? Now, so when he says that will of their own, that they got to be independent of each other. Now, I want you to think of what you already know about the government and whether that's completely the case. He goes on to say, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible, funny word, agency, in the appointment of members of others. Does anybody know what that means, to have agency? I'm not like talking like an insurance agency or some governmental body. I'm talking about having agency. It's more of an adjective. What's that? Control. Okay? You have kind of a certain degree of control. Think of it this way. Your parents still make some decisions for you. And some of you go, you roll your eyes. Yeah, they decide stuff like, should we pay for the heat? Should we pay for his or her phone? They make some decisions for you, right? You're like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. But they may not necessarily tell you what to wear each day as seniors. They might make suggestions. Okay? You're wearing shorts in February? What's up with that? Okay? You're going out like that? Okay? But you have a certain degree of agency. You have the ability to make some decisions for yourself. Okay? He's saying each should have as little agency or the ability to make decisions as possible in the appointment of members of the others. So does Congress vote for the president? No. They vote, but they do that as a private citizen, in the role of private citizen. But we all get to vote. You know what I'm saying? It's not like 100 senators get to vote. Now, there have been times the House of Representatives had to decide that, but he said as little agency as possible. So there are situations where that might have to happen. Okay? Were this principle rigorously adhered to, and in fact, he addresses this right here. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments of the Supreme, Executive, Legislative, and Judiciary magistrates, so he just named out the three branches, right? There they are. He calls them magistrates, but we're talking the three branches. You know them. Should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. So he's saying we should have three branches. They should be independent of each other. And by the way, the Constitution lays that out. But are there instances where maybe one branch does have a say over who's in the other branch? What is the big example? Bigger than what Gabe and I just talked about. The Supreme Court. In fact, we're watching that play out right now, live before a studio audience. Sometimes America is just the best show to watch, or worst show, whichever, okay? All right, that's America. Sometimes you look at America and you look at our history and you're like, oh, you just want to cry. It's like amazing, some of the things. And there's times you want to look at America and you're like, I got to stop looking, but it's like a train. Oh my gosh, it's like that. So he says some deviations, we might have to deviate, go in another direction. Have you guys heard the word deviation in math class somewhere? Standard deviation. Who's taking stats? You did in stats? You probably did some other classes too. Okay. All right. So some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. He's acknowledging that it's not there. And think about this argumentation. He's got an audience that he's trying to convince to ratify the Constitution. Rather than ignore the things they're going to pick on, he's like, I'll address this. We're keeping our branches separate. However, we do have exceptions, and I want to acknowledge that. He says, in the Constitution of the Judiciary Department, so he's addressing the judicial branch, in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle, that principle of giving the other branches little agency, letting the people pick. When it comes to the court, it might not be a great idea to have the people vote for them. It might be for the sake of expediency, that'll take forever. He says, first, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members. It's good to have folks that have a background in law on the court. Yes? Yes. Okay? And you may not like some of the justices, or at least the decisions they make, whether you're conservative or liberal. But we've had a pretty good run with that, of at least people that, like, I don't know, went to law school, practiced as lawyers, practiced as judges in lower courts, had a pretty good run of it. Okay? He says, being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. When the president makes an appointment, he's had a team of people look at the legal record and the background of these folks. Secondly, because the permanent tenure, remember when you're on the court, it's for life. The permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. What does he mean by that? So let's just say, we don't know where it's going, but it could change in days or weeks. Let's say President Trump, by the way, did make an appointment to the Supreme Court for Justice Ginsburg's seat. Does anybody know who he appointed? Some lady. I knew that was coming. Some lady. It is a female justice, yes. Amy Coney Barrett. She's a judge. She's been on the whatever 7th Court of Appeals. She was a law professor at Notre Dame Law School, not exactly a safety school, you know, it's a tough school. Okay. He has always said he'd pick a more conservative justice. She tends to rule conservatively, but she's pretty highly qualified. Let's just say the Senate votes on her and approves her sometime soon. So President Trump appointed her. The current Senate makes her a Supreme Court justice. It's kind of it's really up in the air. Good question. And leaves them some flexibility. Okay. I think they would have to do it if they bring her up for a vote. They have to do it within this session of Congress. Okay. So we have congressional terms. They get to take a vacation and they get a break for like some weeks or months, you know, every year. You know, people who like get a 2-month break. What the heck, you know? Who wants a job like that? Okay. All right. Now, here's the thing. What is he saying about that? If she gets it, she's got it for life. Why is the fact that President Trump picked her and a Republican Senate picked her maybe not a problem, according to Madison? She won't be, especially after they leave office. You know, the makeup of the Senate's going to change. The president, we put term limits on the president. Okay. All right. Even when they didn't have official term limits, you know, there's kind of this assumption they're not going to necessarily have it forever. Okay. So he's saying they're not dependent on them forever, even when we have to do this. See what he does there, though? Like, he knows they're going to have problems with that, but he explains it out. All right. He goes on to say, it is equally evident. Well, let's look at the question first. We need to explain the suggested relationship between the departments. So be ready to do that. I'm going to ask you to write down your explanation before we share. He says, it is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others. Were the executive magistrate, I know he used that word magistrate, but you know he's talking about the branch, or the judges, not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. So what is he saying about the relationship among the three branches? Quick sentence, maybe. I feel like I should have a little music for the sake of the recording. Some of you are going to go listen to it later. So what is he suggesting about the relationship between the departments or branches? What do you think? Come on. They should interact but not interfere. I like that. Okay. I didn't think it that way. Yeah, they're going to interact with each other. They got to interact, okay, to get things done, but not interfere. So, for example, the president, we talked about this earlier, has what is called his public policy, okay? So there might be laws on the books that he doesn't agree with. He might kind of drag his feet in how he enforces it. Stay within the law, but I'm not going to put a big priority on that. Or I'm not going to put a lot of our budget into that. We call that public policy, okay? Senators can be mad about that. Congressmen can be mad about that, but it's in his purview to do that, okay? Congress can make a law and the president may not like it. In fact, sometimes presidents sign a law that they don't really like a whole lot. And they will give kind of a signing statement. I signed it because, you know, there's some really good things in here, but I really have a problem with some of these other things, okay? He can say that all he wants, okay? But he can't necessarily change the law. If he doesn't like the whole law, he can veto it and send it back and they can write a new one or something like that. All right. Madison goes on, first off, this question says, what does the phrase ambition must be made, I know it's cut off, to counteract ambition, which we can kind of figure out here, but let's see what they have to say here. But the great security against the gradual concentration of several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for the defense must in this, as in all cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Okay? So if we think there's a certain danger, we got to have some mechanism in place to deal with it to that level. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So what does he mean by that? What does it mean to say ambition must be made to counteract ambition? Thoughts? What do we got? Do you think like people who aspire to and work towards getting into public office of some sort are not ambitious? They probably work hard. They get a lot of the right people around them. Okay. They go after it. Even those who cheat to get there, you know, they did this or that. They're ambitious. They want the job. They want it. So how can we use ambition to counteract ambition? He's running for Senate. How could the other branch, and he's ambitious about it. We don't want him to get too far out of control. How can we counteract that? Have equally ambitious people, yeah, in the other positions, in the other branches. Okay? These are things people are going to go after. The type of people that really want this are going to go after it. Okay? We're going to have a system that keeps them in check. So sometimes we hear about gridlock in Washington. They're not getting anything done. Or currently, the Senate has passed something that the president will sign, but the House, being run by Democrats, will not. And that seems like a pain in the neck. But it's also part of keeping each other in check. He goes on to say, I want to jump down here. He says, what is government itself but the greatest reflections on human nature? This is like, by the way, we're getting into senior quote material here. I'm not kidding. If you've been thinking about your senior quote, I have a suggestion. Just follow me here. I'm not making this up. Some of you are like, I'm already picking Michael Scott or Ron Swanson for my quote. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, just follow me here. Government, he says, is but the reflections on human nature. Don't the rules we make reflect something about us? Remember when you studied Hammurabi's code back in 9th or 10th grade? You guys studied that, right? You learned a lot about ancient Babylonia from their rules. You learned they really liked harsh punishments because they wanted to keep order. Order was important to them. You learned a lot about their economy from their rules, okay? He's saying who we are is reflected in our government. And this is where I think you're in senior quote material. He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we were always considerate of each other, not so ambitious, thinking of only ourselves, we wouldn't need rules. Think about our current situation. We got rules about 6 feet and masks and all that, correct? But if they said, look, there's this pandemic out there, the best way to deal with it is just wear a mask and be 6 feet, everybody would just kind of do it, right? No, because we're not angels. Right. Okay, we're not angels. He says, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. We wouldn't need to put these checks in place. But that's not the case. So, what is he saying about human nature? Humans are always awesome, right? Wrong. Humans are what? Give me some words that would help us explain bad better. Selfish. What else? Greedy. Ignorant. Sometimes because we're willfully ignorant, sometimes because we can't get to all the information. What's that? Yeah, it's hard to process it all, I know. Did you have something else? Okay. Those are really good. Human nature's that way, and he's saying we have a government that will deal with that. There's a reason to fear what Britain's government was. They had kings who were human beings, okay? Who were selfish, ignorant, greedy, all those things. He goes on to say, and we're going to paraphrase this quick because I want to move on to the next part here, okay? This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all subordinate distributions of power, where the constraint aim is to divide and arrange several offices in such a manner that each may be a check on each other. Now, look, he's getting into checks and balances a little bit here. He's saying they had to be independent of each other, but they're going to have to interact to check each other. But he says this next. He says, but it is possible to give each. It is possible to give each department an equal power. It is not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In Republican government, what does Republican mean? Lowercase r. Say it again. The people. Do the people vote on every law in a Republican government? No. So how do we get laws made? Who makes the laws for us? The people we elect, our representatives. Republican government, representative government. The legislative authority necessarily predominates. So which branch does he say kind of dominates? Legislative, we call it Congress. Awesome. You're on fire. Okay. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches. So you're saying, look, I recognize that this legislative body kind of has a lot of the power. President can't enforce laws that aren't made. The courts can't interpret laws that aren't made. It kind of starts with Congress, right? But he says we have a solution for that. Okay, what's the solution? How is it divided? How is Congress divided? You know this. Senate and the House, right? And he goes on to say, to render them by different modes of election. Back then, they were elected differently. House members were directly elected by the people. State legislatures picked senators. Today, that's different. They're both elected. Some people would argue that we should go back to the old way with the Senate. But he also says that they're different from each other in their common function and different principles of action. Think about how it's the Senate that approves treaties and approves presidential appointments, for example. Think about how the House generates revenue bills, okay? Cool. Let me know what you need.